She had done it in the dark, not knowing what she held. That was what no one in the great hall of Vethkar could explain afterward. Not the elders who had classified her as half-blood refuse, not the council who had stamped her name in the refused bond ledger 6 winters running, not the steward who had laughed when she first arrived at the keep's kitchen gate and asked if there was work. None of them could explain how Sable's hands had found the crown's fracture in total darkness, how her fingers had known the angle of the break, how the iron had seated back into itself without a single sound. They could not explain it because they had not been watching. They never watched her. That was their failure, and it would cost them everything before the bloodroot moon rose over the mountains of Vethkar. She had not known it was broken. She had not known it was a crown. In the year of the Ash Tide, the 15th year since King Duran of Vethkar had sealed the Northern Compact and driven 3 rival packs below the Coldstone Ridge, a woman named Sable Fen worked the midnight shift in the palace repair hall, that low vaulted room beneath the great keep where bent hinges and cracked shields came to be straightened, where the work was quiet and the candles were few and no one of consequence had reason to visit. She had been given the midnight shift because Steward Morcus had decided, in his thorough way, that her presence during the day unsettled the other craftswomen. Too quiet, he said. Half-blood, he said when her back was turned, which she heard anyway, because the quiet ones always hear. She did not argue with the assignment. The midnight shift meant fewer eyes and cooler air, and the particular piece of a stone room when the castle above it had gone to sleep. She had been working for 4 years. She had come to Vethkar at 19 from Sorn, a village at the feet of the Coldstone Ridge that owed the crown a yearly work tribute to cover a debt her father had incurred, and died without paying. The tribute was supposed to be a craftsman. They had sent Sable instead, because she was a debtor's daughter and her brother was too young, and because she was quiet and careful and unlikely to cause trouble. That was the arithmetic of her worth as the village saw it. And it was not a comfortable arithmetic to carry for 4 years in a keep, where worth was announced by bloodline and bond, and she had neither to speak of. Her wolf was small and mostly silent, the way wolves became when they had been told for long enough that they did not belong. She kept it tucked close, like a stone held in a fist underwater, and she did not let it show. The object had come to her work table on the 9th night of the 11th month, wrapped in a piece of plain linen by a palace guard who said only that it needed straightening and set it down and left before she could ask a single question. She unwrapped it. The candle on her table threw a narrow circle of light, and inside that circle she could see a band of dark iron, old and smooth, with a ridge of hammered design at its upper edge and a fracture running along the left lateral curve, not a clean break, but a fault line, the kind that came from repeated stress over a long period, from something heavy being carried by something that was slowly, quietly giving way. She did not know it was the king's iron circlet. She had never been in a room with the king. His name had passed above her head 4 years in casual terse references the way weather passes, and she knew he existed the way she knew the mountain existed, as a fact of the world's arrangement, not as something she was likely to touch. She set the circlet on her work cloth and bent close and ran her thumb along the fault line in the dark space between her 2 candles, feeling the angle of it, the depth, and the way the iron had not quite separated but was moving toward separation the way old things did when they were being held together past the point of natural holding. She picked up her straightening tool. She worked in the dark because she had always worked better by feel than by sight, a thing her father had called her one useful quality before the debt and the dying. She found the fault's apex, the precise center of the fracture where force and counterforce would need to meet, and she pressed. She did not rush. She listened to the iron, which does speak when it is being asked to change, a faint complaint, a settling, a small release of long-held pressure. The circlet spoke to her for 40 minutes in the language of material under careful hands, and then the fault closed. It seated without a seam. She ran her thumb across it twice and could not find where the break had been. She wrapped the circlet in its linen and set it at the edge of her table for collection, and trimmed her candle and thought very little more about it. She did not see Duran of Vethkar until 6 days later, and then only because he walked through the wrong door. The repair hall had two entrances: the upper passage that the palace guard used and the lower corridor that ran to the kitchen and laundry. The upper passage was Duran's door. He walked through the lower corridor at the second bell past midnight on the 15th of the 11th month, and Sable's first thought, before she registered anything else, was that whoever this was had made a mistake. The lower corridor did not lead anywhere useful for a man of his size and bearing. He wore a plain dark tunic and carried no lantern, and the candle at her table was the only light, and he stood at the edge of its reach for a moment before either of them spoke. She said, "This is the repair hall." Not unkindly, not with deference, factual. He did not answer immediately. He was looking at her work table, at the small iron collar she was re-riveting, at her hands, at the linen she had folded to one side. Then he said, "The circlet." "Collected 4 days ago," she said. He crossed to the table. He was close enough now that she could see the scar along his jaw, old and irregular, and the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of cold and vigilance, and the stillness of a man who had learned stillness was safer than movement. He was not what she had expected a king to look like. She did not know what she had expected. Something louder, she supposed. He said, "Who fixed it?" "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "The seam." "There is no seam," she said, which was true. Another silence. He looked at her hands rather than her face, the way she looked at objects rather than at the person who had brought them, finding the truth in the thing that had been worked, rather than in the account someone gave of it. She noticed this and filed it away in the orderly catalogue she kept of useful observations, not yet understanding what it meant that a king read hands. "You work midnight shift," he said. "Morcus put me here." "I know." Something shifted in his face. Not much. A narrowing, a settling. "Why?" It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "He finds my presence unsettling. I'm told it's a quality of character." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite. A registration. He stood at her table for another moment in the candle-lit dark, and she sat at her work and did not stand, because standing felt like performing something she did not feel, and she did not perform things she did not feel. It had cost her in other rooms. It did not cost her here. He looked at her once more, hands first and then face, a brief landing like a hawk checking a surface before deciding whether to alight, and then he said, "Sable Fen." She did not know how he knew her name. She said, "Yes." He left through the upper passage. She heard the guard's surprise above her, the murmur of voices, and then quiet. She turned back to her work. Her heart was moving at a pace that was not entirely her own rhythm, and she did not know what to make of that, and she set it aside as she set aside everything that would not hold still under examination. She thought about the seam and what it meant that he had known where to look. She thought about him knowing her name. She picked up her tool and went back to the rivet. She did not see him again for 11 days, and then she saw him every day for 2 weeks. And then she began to understand that something was happening that had no entry in the catalogues she kept. He came to the repair hall at irregular hours, always through the upper passage now, always with some stated purpose that resolved quickly and left a residue of silence. A hinge to check. A tool he had heard was available in this hall. A question about the alloy composition of a specific grade of Vethkar iron that she answered precisely, because she knew it precisely, and he listened the way people listened when the answer mattered more to them than they had admitted by asking. She worked while he asked his questions. She did not offer more than he sought. He did not ask her to. On the fourth visit, Ada came in from the kitchen corridor while he was there. Ada, who had worked the repair hall's day shift for 11 years, who had given Sable a blanket her first winter and told her which guards were worth a nod and which to ignore, whose knuckles were thick and scarred from a life of useful work, and who wore her gray hair braided in a flat crown around her head as if she had decided the crown was owed her and simply taken it. Ada stopped in the doorway, and her face went very carefully neutral in the way of people who had long practiced making themselves small. Sable watched this and felt the familiar compressed weight of it, the cost of smallness paid daily by those who had learned it was their price of passage. Duran looked at Ada. He said, "Fenn's work. Is it always this quality?" Ada said, "Best hands in the keep," and surprised herself Sable could see by saying it without cushioning. Since she arrived." He nodded. He left. Ada stood in the doorway for a moment after the door to the upper passage had closed, and then she looked at Sable with an expression Sable did not quite have a name for, though she recognized its shape, the look of someone who has seen something unexpected and is deciding whether to trust it. 4 years, Ada said. And it took him a cracked crown. Sable said, "I didn't know it was a crown." "No," Ada said. "I imagine that's exactly why." Sable turned this over for several days without arriving at a conclusion. The conclusion arrived on its own, unbidden, at the 30th visit, when Duran set down on her work table a small broken latch mechanism from the council chamber door and stood at her shoulder while she examined it, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cool of the stone hall, and her wolf uncoiled inside her chest for the first time in 4 years, with a lurch like something surfacing from cold water, and she understood all at once that her wolf had been holding its breath in this keep for 4 years, and was only now, in this moment and this proximity, willing to let it go. She did not let any of this show. She fixed the latch. She set it at the table's edge. She said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Who told you it was broken?" He said, "No one. I noticed." She looked at the latch. She felt the thing her wolf was trying to tell her and chose, in that moment, not to hear it. She had very good practice not hearing things. She said, "It'll hold now." He said, "I know." And then, in a different register, quieter, the way people spoke in the dark when they were saying something they would not say in the light. Sable. Just her name, nothing after it. She made herself very still. He left. What she did not know, and what the corridor above her had known for 6 days, was that Morcus had gone to the council. What she did not know was that Morcus had told the 6 senior elders that the king had been observed spending significant time in the repair hall with a half-blood work tribute from Sorn, and that Morcus had used words she had heard applied to her before, words about contamination, about the danger of an unregistered wolf insinuating herself into proximity with power, about the damage a foreign scent could do to a king's judgment. What she did not know was that Councillor Bren, who had held his position for 20 years on the strength of his ability to remove inconveniences before they became complications, had listened and had said, when Morcus finished, "We handle it quietly." She did not know any of this. She came to her shift the next evening, and Ada was not in the corridor, and the repair hall was dark, and the upper passage door was standing open, which it never was. 2 palace guards were inside. They told her she was being reassigned. They told her the specific building, a storage annex outside the main walls, where tribute goods were catalogued before distribution. They told her the reassignment was effective immediately. They did not tell her why, and they waited while she gathered her tools. And one of them stood very close to the doorway the entire time, in the manner of someone who has been instructed to ensure a thing is completed. She gathered her tools. She was careful. She was methodical. Her wolf went back under. The storage annex was cold in the way buildings were cold when no one who mattered was expected to occupy them, and she was given a small iron brazier that produced more smoke than warmth, and a cot that had seen better decades. She catalogued tribute goods. She was precise about it, because she was precise about everything, and she did not ask questions, because questions required an audience willing to hear them. 3 days passed. On the evening of the third day, Ada appeared at the annex door with a wrapped parcel of bread and hard cheese, and a face that was carrying something heavy. Ada said, "Morcus went to the council." She said it the way she said all difficult things, flatly, with the information leading and her own feelings trailing at a distance. "They moved you before he could see what was happening," Sable said. "Before who could see?" Ada sat down on the near crate and set the parcel on the table. "The king has been asking where you are." The quiet that followed was very loud. Sable said, "It was a crown." She was not entirely speaking to Ada. "In the dark, and I fixed it, and I didn't know it was his." She paused. "And he knew I didn't know." "Yes," Ada said. "That was the thing. That was what he was looking at." She had understood it on the 30th visit. Half understood it. Held it at arm's length. She understood it fully now. He had come back to the repair hall not because there were things to fix, though there were. He had come back because she had touched what was broken in him without understanding what she was touching, without an agenda, without the court's angles and the council's arithmetic. And that had startled him the way something startles when it has been held together by its own will for a very long time and is suddenly, unexpectedly, allowed to rest. "And Morcus moved me before he could decide what to do about it." Atta said, "Morcus moved you because Morcus is afraid of what happens when a king decides." Outside the annex, the night was very cold. Sable could hear the wind off the cold stone ridge and the distant sound of the gate guard changing, and beyond that, silence. She looked at the wrapped parcel Ada had brought and felt the ordinary, specific gratitude of the cared for, a feeling she had learned to hold carefully because it was rare and she had dropped it before. She said, "What is Morcus planning?" Ada's hands folded on the crate. "Council meets at the Bloodroot Moon in 11 days. They're registering your status formally as a bond risk, which carried the authority to authorize expulsion. Once it's registered, even the king can't undo it without council majority, and Morcus has the council majority." 11 days. Sable counted them the way she counted fault lines in iron, feeling for where the pressure was most acute. "And the king doesn't know what they've built yet. He knows you're gone. He doesn't know about the registration." "Who told you?" "One of the guards who moved you." He felt bad about it. Ada looked at her with the clear, plain gaze of someone who had watched 4 years of careful work and was deciding now that careful was insufficient. "The steward is going to use the crown. He knows you fixed it. He's going to argue that an unregistered half-blood who has been handling the king's personal items without disclosure is exactly the kind of threat the bond risk category was written for." Sable looked at her hands. She thought about the fault line, the angle, the 40 minutes of patient listening. She thought about the way the iron had spoken. She thought about Duran saying her name in the dark, in a register that was different from every other register she had heard from him, quieter, more costly. She thought about her wolf, which had been holding its breath for 4 years and had let it go. She said, "I need to show the council something." She worked through the night, not sleeping. What she needed was documentation, not testimony, which could be dismissed, but material fact. The repair hall had a ledger. Every object that passed through was logged. Date received, description, work performed, date returned. She had kept that ledger with the same precision she brought to the work itself, because precision was how she made herself legible in a world that did not want to read her. The ledger would show the circlet. It would show the date and the work performed and the return. But what it would not show, what she needed to make the council see, was the circlet itself. The seamless fault. The crown that had been broken for a long time before she touched it. The proof that it had been carrying a fracture the court had not noticed, the king had not disclosed, and she had resolved in total darkness without asking for credit. She needed the crown. She needed to stand in front of the council with it in her hands and show them where the break had been and show them that it was gone, and make them understand that she had not handled what was precious because she was reaching for power. She had handled it because it was given to her, broken, in the dark, and she had done the only thing she knew how to do with broken things. She needed someone to get the crown. She sat for a long time in the cold of the annex. Her wolf was very still. She thought about Ada and the blanket, and the 4 years of small, steady kindnesses and the bread and cheese sitting wrapped on the table. And she thought about what it cost a person to risk the small, steady life they had built, and she did not ask Ada. She thought about the guard who had felt bad. She thought about the upper corridor and where it led out. She thought about the fact that Duran was asking where she was. She wrote a single sentence on a scrap of ledger paper. She folded it very precisely. She gave it to the annex's one window slot just before dawn, where the morning kitchen run passed, and she watched it go. She catalogued tribute goods all the next day with her hands and not her mind. Her mind was elsewhere, running through angles the way it ran through fault lines, feeling for where the stress was highest and what would need to give. When evening came, Atta appeared again. Atta set a cloth bundle on the table. Sable unwrapped it. The iron circlet lay in her hands, dark and cool, the hammer design ridge catching the brazier light. She turned it and ran her thumb along the left lateral curve. Smooth. Not a trace. She closed her fingers around it and felt her wolf unfurl against her ribs like something that had been folded too long and was finally being permitted its full shape. She said, "He sent it." "No," Atta said, with a look that was complicated and quiet. "He brought it." Sable looked at her. "He's in the yard." The yard behind the annex was not a formal space. It was the gap between the outer wall and the storage building. Flagstone, a stack of empty tribute crates against the stone, cold air coming off the ridge in a long, steady press. Duran stood at the crates. He wore no crown. She came out with the circlet in one hand, and she stood in the yard, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her on the first visit. The way she had not known how to read then, and was beginning to know how to read now. Hands first and then face. A settling, as if the looking confirmed something. He said, "Morcus." "Yes." "He didn't tell me he was moving you." "No," she said. "He moved me before you could tell him not to." Something crossed his face. Not a performance. A truth arriving late. She held out the circlet. He did not take it. He looked at it in her hands, and he said, "Turn it." She turned it. Where was the break? She put her thumb on the place. Smooth. No seam, no ridge, no roughness. His jaw tightened, and she felt the recognition in it. Not surprised, she thought, because he had known the moment he put on the repaired crown, had known immediately by the absence of the familiar fault, the absence of the small shift he had learned to compensate for, the sensation of something being whole that had been half for a long time. She said, "You didn't tell me it was broken." "No." "You didn't tell anyone." His silence was its own answer. She thought about that. A king who kept his fractures private. A king who had sent a broken thing to a midnight shift hall where no one would ask questions, attended by a woman the court had decided wasn't worth watching. She thought about the weight of a fracture carried for years, the discipline required to hold a thing together past the point of natural holding. She thought about that discipline and recognized it from the inside. She said, "The council meets in 9 days." "I know what Morcus is building," he said. "I've known for 2 days. And I am the king of Vethkar," he said, with a flatness that was not arrogance, but something closer to exhaustion. the exhaustion of a man who had spent years using that fact as a tool and was freshly aware of its limits. And the council majority belongs to Morcus because I have spent 8 years consolidating military power at the expense of political capital. And I have 6 who will vote against the registration, and he has 9. And in 9 days, he files the paperwork, and you become a bond risk on record, and I cannot undo that without a majority I don't have. He said all of this without looking away from her. She held the circlet and looked back. She said, "Then we need to give the 6 votes a reason to become 10. A pause. What reason? She held up the circlet. I fixed this in the dark. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know it was yours. It's in the ledger. Date received, description. Work performed, return. The court didn't know it was broken. You didn't disclose it. The circlet passed through the repair hall as an anonymous piece of ironwork, and I treated it like any other anonymous piece of ironwork." She waited for him to follow where this was going. He was already following. She could see it. Morcus is going to argue that I was reaching, that an unregistered half-blood handling the king's personal items is precisely what the bond risk category was written for. He cannot make that argument if the record shows clearly that I was handed something I did not know was yours and returned it without asking for credit. I was not reaching. I was working. He'll argue intent. He'll try. He needs proof of intent. The ledger doesn't show intent. It shows 4 years of repair work on every item that came through that hall. She looked at the circlet. What it also shows is that the crown was broken, that no one in the court knew, that the one person who noticed it and fixed it was a half-blood work tribute on the midnight shift who kept no record of it beyond the standard log entry and said nothing to anyone. She looked up. That is not the profile of a woman who is reaching, and every one of those 10 council elders knows it. And if they are put in a room with the ledger and the crown, and asked to vote their conscience instead of their alignment, Morcus loses 3. She needed 3. 9 minus 3 was 6. 6 apiece was a tie. A tie resolved to the king. Daran was very still. She was aware of him in the way she had been aware of him in the repair hall, that particular quality of attention, total without being intrusive, a kind of listening she had not often received from anyone with power to give or withhold things. He said, "You planned this in one night." "I had a working premise in 9 days," she said. "I work best with constraints." The corner of his mouth moved. She remembered that motion from the repair hall, its first occurrence, and she found it settled something in her that had been unsettled since Ada's second visit. He said, "Sable." The quieter register again, the one that cost something. She waited. "You fixed what was broken without knowing what it was," he said, "and then you didn't tell anyone. 4 years in this keep, and you have never once played what you held." He was looking at her hands, then her face. "Do you know what that is worth in a court like this one?" She said, "About the same as it's worth anywhere, which is nothing, until someone decides to see it." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind came off the ridge. She held the crown. He said, "I see it." She felt her wolf make a sound that was not quite a sound, a vibration in the chest, a recognition that came before the mind could sort it. She kept her face steady. She was very practiced at keeping her face steady. She said, "Then let's make sure the council sees it too." The bloodroot moon rose 9 days later over the mountains of Vethkar and turned the courtyard flagstones to copper, and the council chamber filled at the second bell with all 15 elders in their formal gray, and Morcus stood at the head of the chamber with his registration document and his 9 votes, and his expression of satisfied anticipation, and Sable Fen walked in through the eastern door carrying a repair ledger and an iron circlet. She walked in alone. That was important. She had argued for it, and Daran had agreed, because what she needed the 10 to see was not a woman under royal protection. What she needed them to see was a woman who had walked in carrying her own evidence. Marcus registered her presence and a muscle in his jaw tightened. He had not expected this. He had expected to proceed without her. Expected that the annex and the distance and the isolation would hold. Expected that the thing he was building would be completed before anyone could produce a counter-argument. Sable noted all of this and set her ledger on the table and set the circlet beside it, and she looked at the 10 council elders she did not yet have, and she said, clearly, in the way she said things that were factual and important, "I would like to show you something before this registration proceeds." What followed was not, in the strict sense, a legal proceeding, but it was a reckoning, and reckonings had their own architecture, their own rules. She opened the ledger to the 9th night of the 11th month, and she read the entry aloud. Date received, description, work performed, return, in her flat, careful voice, and she set the ledger on the table and turned the circlet in her hands, and she put her thumb on the place where the fault had been, and showed them the smooth iron, seamless, as if the break had never existed. She said, "This was given to me broken. I did not know what it was. I fixed it and I returned it, and I wrote one line in a ledger. I did not ask who it belonged to. I did not ask for anything in return. I want you to vote on what you see in this room." Councillor Bren said, from the middle of the table, "The King's Crown, handled by an unregistered bond risk." She said, "Handled by a craftwoman doing her job." She waited a beat. "The crown was broken for months before I touched it. The king did not disclose it. The court did not notice it. I noticed it because I was paying attention, and I fixed it because fixing things is what I do, and I want you to ask yourselves which of those facts is the threat." The chamber was quiet in the specific way chambers were quiet when the air had been charged, and people were feeling the charge rather than the prepared argument. The door at the chamber's north end opened. The air changed before he was visible, the way it always changed, a heaviness and an organizing, bodies straightening without being told. Duran came through the door wearing the iron circlet on his brow and his formal black cloak, and nothing in his bearing that resembled apology. He walked the length of the chamber without speaking, and he came to the table and he stood beside Sable Fen, not behind her, not above her, beside her. And he looked at Morcus across the table and he said, "Call the vote." Morcus said, "My lord, the registration is in order." "I know what you have in order," Daran said. "Call the vote." Morcus called the vote. He had 9. He had expected 9, and he counted them in his head as the vote proceeded, and when it was done, the count was 7-8, and he stood very still as he understood that he had lost 2, and that 2 was not the 3. Sable had calculated but that 2 plus the king's own voice resolved to a tie that resolved to the king, and the king's voice was already resolving. Duran said, "The registration is rejected." He said it in the flat declarative of a man stating a fact. He looked at Morcus. "The ledger will be entered into the council's permanent record. The crown's repair is documented in public." A pause, the precise length of a held breath. "If another motion is filed against Sable Fen of this keep, the filing party will answer to me for the grounds." Morcus had held his position for 20 years. He had filed many motions against many inconveniences and watched them resolve in the direction he had intended. He stood in the council chamber with the bloodroot moon through the high windows turning everything the color of embers, and he looked at the king and the half-blood craftwoman standing beside each other at the council table, and something in his face passed through all its available stations and settled on defeat. He said nothing. He gathered his papers. He left. The 8 remaining elders were quiet for a moment. Then Councillor Aldra, who was the oldest and had said nothing during the entire proceeding, looked at Sable with the particular expression of someone who has been watching for years and has only now been given permission to say what they were watching. She said, 4 years. Not quite a question. Sable said, 4 years. Aldra nodded slowly. It was the nod of a debt being acknowledged. Sable understood it and filed it away. The chamber emptied. Atta appeared at the eastern door when the last elder had gone, as if she had been waiting outside, which she had, because Atta knew the architecture of things and had positioned herself accordingly. Atta looked at the room, and at the two people remaining in it, and her expression was not complicated. It was relieved, and it was satisfied, and it held the particular quiet pride of someone who has waited a long time to see a thing confirmed. She left without being asked to, which was also the architecture of things. Duran stood beside the table. The circlet was on his brow. Sable stood with her ledger in her hands. The bloodroot moon was at full height, the light through the windows copper and cold, and the chamber was very still. She said, 7 to 8. I needed a tie, he said. A tie resolved to me. You planned for a tie. I knew Bren would hold. I thought Aldra would move. She did. Eventually. Sable looked at the ledger. 2 days ago. He looked at her. She came to the annex, Sable said. She asked me the same question you asked. About the fault. About the dark. She paused. I showed her where the break had been. She didn't say much. But she came back. He was very still. She was aware of the quality of his attention focused on her entirely, the weight of it, and she stood inside it without performing anything. She had stopped performing things around him several visits ago. He said, Sable. She waited. He lifted the circlet from his brow. He turned it in his hands, the way she had turned it, finding the place on the left lateral curve where the fault had been. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the table between them. He said, I have been carrying that fracture for 6 years, my father's crown, cracked when the Northern Compact was signed and a rival Pax blade came close enough to leave a mark on the iron. I wore it every day. I did not tell anyone. I did not know how to hand something broken to a person and ask them to fix it without explaining all of it. And I did not know if there was anyone in this keep who would fix it without the explanation becoming a lever. She understood then why he had wrapped it in plain linen and sent it through the guard without a name attached. He had not been testing her. He had been hoping, quietly and without expectation, that the dark would do what daylight with all its angles could not. She said, You could have asked. I didn't know you. And now. He looked at her with the full quality of that attention. He said, I know you. She looked at the circlet on the table, the smooth place on the left lateral curve, the iron that had been broken and was whole. She thought about her wolf, which was not tucked under at all anymore, which was sitting open inside her chest the way it had been sitting open since the 30th visit, comfortable in its own space for the first time in 4 years. She thought about Atta's bread and the wrapped parcel and the guard who had felt bad, and Aldra's nod, and the 8 months of repair hall visits, and the way the room had always felt different when he was in it. And she thought about the fact that she had never, in 4 years, had anyone in this keep who looked at her hands first, because they knew the hands were where the truth was. She picked up the circlet and held it out to him. He took it from her hands, and where his fingers met hers over the iron there was warmth, specific and deliberate, and neither of them moved away from it. He did not put the crown back on. He set it down again, between them on the table, and he said, quietly, in the register that cost something, Stay. Not an order. She had heard his orders. This was not shaped like an order. It was shaped like a door held open. A question asked by someone who already knew they were asking for more than they had the right to ask and was asking anyway. She said, I was already going to. And because this was true, and she did not say things that were not, she let it stand without elaboration. The bloodroot moon shifted in the high windows. The copper light moved on the stone floor. Atta was in the corridor outside, Sable knew, listening to the silence inside and reading it correctly, because Ada knew the architecture of things. The circlet lay between them on the council table, its fault lines sealed, its surface smooth. She had fixed it in the dark, not knowing what she held. He had kept the fracture private for 6 years. She had handed it back whole without asking for anything in return, and he had understood, from the moment he put it on his brow and felt the absence of the familiar give, that what had been broken was not only iron. He was right about that. She thought he usually was, about the things that mattered. She did not say this. Some truths did not need to be said. They needed to be held carefully, the way you held something that had been damaged and was now whole. She picked up her ledger from the table. He held the door to the upper passage. She walked through it, and he walked beside her, and behind them, in the empty chamber, the bloodroot moon moved through its arc, and the copper light faded towards silver, and the crown of Vethkar rested on the council table unmarked, and the year of the ash tide settled toward its close with the particular permanence of things that had been fixed all the way through. Ada was in the corridor. She looked at the two of them, and she said nothing at all. She handed Sable the wrapped parcel she had been carrying, which was still bread and hard cheese, because Ada believed in the concrete fact of what kept people standing, and she turned and walked toward the kitchen and did not look back. Sable held the parcel. Darren walked beside her. She was no longer on the midnight shift.